continuing on from the last point from the last video, whilst these religious sort of movements borrowed this metaphysical project, and thus they based the natural sciences of this metaphysical project, moving into the 17th century, natural scientists and philosophers began to criticize this approach to theology, and they forged a separation between the study of God and the natural and human sciences. There are various reasons for this. One point to mention about the difficulty that may arise with trying to bridge the gap between metaphysics and natural sciences, again in a modern context, would be that the corpus and literature of both philosophy and metaphysics and of the natural sciences has become so vast and has become so excessive, and so much training is now required in both the rational sciences and the metaphysical sciences and the natural sciences to achieve any degree of expertise in them, that it is increasingly becoming difficult for one to be both a scientist and a theologian, or a scientist and a philosopher. In the past, a philosopher generally was also a scientist, and that was because, first of all, the study of these sciences, because the corpus, the study of the corpus of these sciences was not developed to that large of a degree. You could, in theory, study a scholarship course in the Christian tradition or the Muslim tradition or the Jewish tradition, and you could, in a few years, become both an expert scientist and an expert philosopher. But now, really, you could only become one of these. If we maintain the traditional modes of learning, that gap between the two can't be bridged. One way, however, that this can be solved is by the arrival of the internet and the fact that people have access to all sorts of resources and they can self-study these sciences. Because it's no longer required to go to a university which has a monopoly over these resources and you train in one discipline, then you train in another discipline. You can, by your own free will and by your own scheduling and your own determination, by having access to all these resources via the internet, study them yourself and obtain a decent degree of expertise in both. Of course, an issue here is that self-study might not give you the level of expertise that studying under a teacher would, but a simple solution to that is online classes or online courses, whereby at the very least you can refer back to an expert in a lecture if you don't understand something, and if you can't understand it completely, then you can simply listen to a series of lectures by that expert online according to your own pace, and thus you would be able to understand that subject. However, in general, there is a need to once again bridge the gap between the natural sciences and philosophy and classical metaphysics. And like I mentioned in the last video, we need a firm metaphysical foundation from which to operate the natural sciences in. Otherwise, the scientific project in and of itself becomes compromised on a philosophical basis. For example, there's a basic assumption in the scientific method that there's a distinction between mental reality and extra-mental reality, meaning things exist outside of the mind, independently of the mind, they have a real existence, and we can observe and interact with them, and thus we can sort of make scientific observations and deductions and hypotheses about them and test for cause and effect relations. However, that assumption is based on like classical metaphysics or classical philosophy, let's say, and there's no way to prove that without classical metaphysics and classical philosophy. And so there's nothing stopping a person from saying that what you observe is simply a figment of your imagination or it's not real. So without classical metaphysics and classical philosophy, you wouldn't have that assumption in the first place. Hence why you need that metaphysical basis on which to operate the natural sciences in. And when I refer to classical metaphysics and classical philosophy, we could, of course, in theory and in practice, this would have to be a revised version of classical metaphysics and philosophy. It would be a kind of neo-traditionalist thought, and a revised kind of traditionalist thought which has a firm metaphysical foundation for the scientific project. Anyhow, within the 17th century, this separation began to take place. The idea that natural and human sciences can only be understood on the basis of direct experience gained authority and revolutionized the intellectual landscape of the Western world. This tended to ignore the importance of a priori philosophical truths or first philosophical principles, as Al-Ghazali and other great classical thinkers mentioned. For example, Al-Ghazali mentioned that indeed the first philosophical principles aren't sought after, meaning they aren't proven, for indeed they are self-evident and apparent to the mind. He mentions this in works like Al-Munqidhu min al-Dalal, Deliverance from Error. These a priori truths are self-evident and true in and of themselves, and they form the basis for our assumptions and framework for the way we perceive and understand the world, and of which we base our worldview on. However, the Enlightenment, by challenging the theologian's singular approach to knowledge, the door suddenly swung open all kinds of scientific and philosophical exploration. This was definitely important for the time because, unfortunately, many religious institutions may have become stagnant to a decent degree. This doesn't mean that they were irrational per se, but it just means that they had become dogmatic in their approach, and they ignored the importance of dialogue and sort of freedom of being able to discuss new academic ideas and developing new concepts. And the reality is that within the Western tradition and in the Islamic tradition and really in various traditions, but more specifically and with more emphasis in the Western tradition, this kind of pluralistic attitude and openness to the truth was always a part of this intellectual sort of heritage. However, over the years, of course, the Catholic Church may have become more dogmatic, and dogmatism may have become more prevalent. And hence, it was important to open the door to this more pluralistic academic approach, where we evaluate the evidences and try to develop new ideas, or try to revive old ideas that may still be useful, and not just have this one-sided view of things. Now, of course, this may present the difficulty and issue that religion may have been viewed as dogmatic and irrational. The reality is that traditional theology and traditional sort of metaphysics and philosophy, especially as used by, let's say, the Catholic Church and, let's say, the Muslim world or the Jewish world at the time, it wasn't irrational. They were using rational arguments. They were using the arguments of Greek philosophers. It was just that, they were using these perhaps in a dogmatic manner, and it wasn't necessarily the case that they weren't engaging with opposing ideas. So there is a bit of nuance here. However, at the same time, like has been mentioned, this emphasis on being academic and being pluralistic and engaging with different ideas more openly, and just generally not persecuting other people for having different views, it was a very important development of the Enlightenment, and one in which, even if we were to, let's say, return to a neo-traditionalist society, I still do genuinely believe that this freedom of expression and freedom of academic ideas will still be retained. And I doubt that people would be willing to let go of this fundamental right of theirs, even in a neo-traditionalist society. In fact, tradition itself and classical religions would very arguably teach us and encourage us to have this dialogue and engage with different ideas and engage with the world, and not to simply censor other people for their beliefs, and not to be tyrannical in our approach to religious and academic questions. It was around this time that Galileo famously challenged the Church's doctrine that the sun revolved around the earth, presenting scientific findings that showed the opposite. Too far ahead of his time, he was forced to refute his claim to avoid being burned at the stake as a heretic. Yet his discovery was correct. He later became the most celebrated champion of this new science. This astonishing transformation in the Western world's approach to religion, it was made possible by two major historical events. the devastating wars of religion and the Reformation that started then. It's very unfortunate to note, obviously, that Christians were initially a very persecuted class of people during the Roman Empire and in the early years, and many of the early church fathers were martyred. However, as soon as Christians gained power, they started to persecute other people for their religious beliefs. And obviously, it's an ironic and sad part of history, but in many cases, the persecutors become the persecuted, and the persecuted become the persecutors. Hence, it's important in every tradition and in every religious sort of belief system to emphasize the importance of, first of all, freedom of expression, freedom of beliefs, but also not to have this kind of tyrannical, dogmatic approach. And people look back at history and wonder how people could have been so tyrannical to other people simply for having different beliefs. But we also need to know that human nature, is one interesting and complicated thing. People can become very easily emotionally charged on certain issues that are important in their context, in their time, and as a result commit unspeakable atrocities.